Good evening, everyone. My name is Sriya Iyer, and welcome to the SCORE Social Consequences of Religion lecture as part of the SCORE Strand 3 research program on religion and economic development. It is wonderful to see you all here, and thank you so much for coming this evening. Here in Cambridge, we are delighted to be able to contribute to the SCORE program, generously funded by the Templeton Religion Trust. This program is a multi-decade, multinational, and multi-million-dollar program to investigate religions and their consequences globally. It is ambitious in its scope and well-intentioned in its execution to combine academic research with a deep regard and respect for policy over a long time horizon. The program currently has 3 strands which are live on religion and cooperation, religion and peace building, and this one on religion and economic development, which we are leading from Cambridge Economics. There are more SCORE strands to follow in the future as well. As a part of Strand 3's activities, we are delighted to host this lecture this evening by Professor Paul Seabright. This lecture is also sponsored by the Janeway Institute in Cambridge, to whom we are also very grateful. Paul Seabright did his undergraduate and doctoral studies in Oxford and taught at the then Faculty of Economics and Politics in Cambridge from 1987 to 2000. Since then, he has been Professor of Economics at the Toulouse School of Economics. From 2012 to 2021, he was Director of the Institute for Advanced Study in Toulouse. He is the author of The Company of Strangers, A Natural History of Economic Life. Paul Seabright is a profoundly well-read scholar, a deep thinker, and my teacher. His latest book, The Divine Economy, was published by Princeton University Press in May earlier this year and makes the case for thinking about religious organizations as platforms. Having had the great fortune to read it, may I say that it is very wide-ranging, insightful, and enjoyable, drawing on evidence from psychology, anthropology, history, sociology, economics, and other disciplines. Hence, I am very excited to welcome back Professor Paul Seabright to Cambridge and to invite him to deliver this SCORE Strand 3 lecture on the divine economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sriya. Thank you, everybody. It is such a pleasure to be back here in Cambridge, to see so many familiar faces, and to be able to talk to you about a subject that I was already sort of nurturing somewhere in what parts of my brain all of those years ago, but which I didn't really start researching on until sometime after I'd left Cambridge. What I want to do is to give you a very quick overview of what's in the book and to try and spend a little bit of time talking about what comes next, because that's what this SCORE initiative is about. It's about launching research on the economics of religion in a very broad sense. And what I want to convince you, this is one of the most exciting fields of research in the social sciences now. And so I want the talk to be reasonably forward-looking, as well as obviously giving you a quick tour of what's actually in the book. Now, let me see if I can master the technology. So this is the book. I'm very grateful to Princeton University Press for accepting to publish it. I think they've done a fantastic job with it as a physical object. I like reading it, I like holding it, I think it's beautifully printed. So that's the obligatory publicity. But it is heartfelt. I think they've done a fabulous job with it as a book, and I don't know how long it's still going to be part of the habits of the Western world to handle objects made of dead trees, but so long as it's there, I'm very happy that Princeton has enabled me to do that. So I want to start by telling you about 2 people. The first person is a parishioner at this church, which is in Ghana, in Accra, in a place that I did some research with a team of colleagues, mostly based in the Toulouse School of Economics. This is a very grainy shot taken on my phone of a Revival Week sermon in one of the Assemblies of God churches in central Accra. There are probably, we calculate, about 2,500 people in this building. They're in the middle of a 3-hour sermon at which they're being repeatedly solicited for contributions. And from time to time in the sermon, there's a surge forward of people who come towards the two speakers who are doing a kind of double act sermon, one in English, one in Twi, which is one of the local languages. And the worshippers are putting a lot of money into a large round cauldron in front of the dais, the stage on which the sermon is taking place. And then there's music and chanting and quite a lot of dancing and so on. And the crowd is clearly having a great time. And shortly after this point, the choir began to sing a hymn whose refrain, which I think is very evocative, was, "I had a debt I could not pay. He paid a debt he did not owe. I needed someone to wash my sins away." And that kind of religious come financial imagery is everywhere to be found in the communications of this particular church, as in many others, and is going to be at the heart of what I've been studying in this work. And the person I want to talk to you about is a young parishioner at this church. Her name, I call her Grace. I don't actually know her name. We were very rigorous about keeping anonymity for the participants in our experimental work. We conducted the experiments in a secular site off the church premises, but we played various economic experiments with them, and then we debriefed them in detailed questionnaires. And I talked to her, and my first impression looking at her, she was a well-spoken, quiet, simply but well-dressed young woman, aged 24. I guessed that she had a reasonable education and was perhaps a clerk in a government office or worked as an accountant in a small business. And I could not have been more wrong. She works 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, selling iced water in little plastic packets from a basket on the top of her head, which she sells to motorists walking up and down the lines of cars coming in on one of the freeways to Accra. They block up at the traffic lights, and she goes up selling, up and down selling. She's insulted and abused by many of the drivers. She inhales exhaust fumes all day long. In the evening, she goes home to a small hut that she built with her aunt, with whom she came from the countryside. And on Sundays, she goes to church. And I want to know what she does there, and I can tell you that she can wear a clean dress. She's an usher. She greets the people as they come into the church. She shows them to their seats. She is a Sunday school attendant. She sings in the choir. And we calculated between us that she gives about 12% of her very, very meager income to the church. The pastor of the church, whom in the book I call Father William, is a very charming, very lively, very outgoing, gregarious man. He is very, very rich, and he wants everybody to know it. He's not embarrassed about it. He wears a buckle around his waist, with a belt around his waist with a large buckle that has a dollar sign on it. He drives a very large car, and he believes that his wealth is the result of the Lord smiling on him, and he wants his parishioners to share the smile of the Lord. And I want to know why she gives a lot of money to this man. And the one answer you can't give is that she's stupid or a fool or in some sense deceived. She's extremely lucid. We talked a great deal about all of the various things she spends money on and what she could spend money on if she were not giving it to the church. She could, for example, spend money on healthcare for her aunt, who is often sick. She is more lucid about her finances than I am about mine. And the one thing I want to know, and it runs through the book, is what is she doing? What does she think she's doing? What are the reasons why she gives so much money to this very rich man? And what is the place of this institution in her life? And so that's sort of the first thing that I want you to think about, and it's going to run through the book and through the questions that I ask. The next person I want you to think about is this man, Pope Francis. This is from an article by the late, great David Gardner, who was Financial Times Middle East correspondent and a very, very well-considered and thoughtful commentator on events in the Middle East. Its headline, Pope Francis Fights a Losing Battle in the Middle East, the Mass Flight of Christians from the Region Continues Unchecked. And I want to give you a sense of some of the things that if you're paying attention to the news and the media, you will be thinking about the place of religion in the world today. So this is from Foreign Affairs in September 2020, written by the also late, great Ronald Inglehart, about his book called Religion's Sudden Decline. The book is called Giving Up on God, The Global Decline of Religion. It's not just Inglehart, it's not just sociologists. This is from Gallup. US church membership falls below the majority for the first time. Here from the Pew Research Center in 2021, about 3 in 10 US adults are now religiously unaffiliated. Now, I don't think I've cherry-picked those examples. To read the press, you would think two things about what's happening to religion in the world today. One is that Christianity is in retreat, caught in a kind of pincer movement between secular atheism on the one hand and militant Islam on the other. You would also think that violent struggle is replacing peaceful proselytism as the main engine of religious competition. And what I want to persuade you, and it's the central theme of the book, is that almost everything about this picture is wrong. It's almost entirely inaccurate. And I want to suggest not just that it's inaccurate, but I also want to suggest that it's inaccurate for very interesting reasons, because it's actually quite a compelling picture. I'm going to show you some information suggesting why this is a natural thing to conclude about the place of religion in the world today, and what we should think about it instead. So, the truth, I think, is interestingly different. First of all, Christianity and Islam are both globally on the advance, and I want to show you some numbers that make that point. Secondly, religiosity, which is difficult to measure, even to define, is a complex, multidimensional phenomenon, which is in some places increasing, some places decreasing. But there is absolutely no evidence that it is globally decreasing. Secondly, people are increasingly mixing and matching in their religious activity, as in many other areas of life. And the mixing and matching is being widely mistaken for a decline in the importance of religion, but these two are not the same thing. Thirdly, proselytism and demography are the main drivers of religious change, not violent struggle. And fourth, and this is really the subject of the book, religion is adapting to modernity. It's becoming corporatized and branded, and it is pushing out local and small and let's say traditional religions across the world. It's not pushing them out in the sense of making them disappear. It's pushing them to the margins, where they continue to operate in the margins in a symbiotic relationship with these large, global, corporatized, branded religions, but it is changing profoundly the place that they have in the world. And what the book argues is that religious rivalry is a form of platform competition. Now, those of you who are economists will know that I spent enough years in Toulouse, the origin of platform economics, to have been thoroughly brainwashed. I am the member of a cult, and I am now giving you the cult's view on platforms as the explanation for everything. But I have come to believe it because I think the evidence is in its favor, and I hope that if the evidence ceases to be in its favor, I will leave the cult, but that obviously you will have to judge for yourselves. Now, what's important is that the way in which platforms function is not a purely materialist picture. Platforms offer, as you'll see, a complicated mix of goods and services to their members, but these are not just material goods and services. That offering of goods and services to their members interacts with three very important characteristics that the most successful platforms have been able to operate. One is ritual. The rituals that religious platforms offer are not just like the rituals that non-religious platforms offer. The second thing is moral identity. And if you think back to young Grace in the church in Accra, this church offers her an ability to find her moral identity in the way that essentially no competing institutions in the scary city of Accra can conceivably hope to do. And secondly, it offers narrative about people's place in the world, about the role of suffering, about why our lives are so often a struggle. And although secular people might bemoan the inability of secular institutions to offer competing narratives, the basic fact remains that in today's world, religious platforms often offer more compelling narratives. I mean this descriptively. I'm not meaning that they ought to be found more compelling, but they are found more compelling by a very large proportion of the world's population. Okay, so that's where I'm going with the talk. Now, what am I going to do? So I'm going to summarize what the book covers, and it basically goes in the following way. There's a big section on the place of religion in the modern world, which first of all looks at what we know about religious affiliation, which is a very simple yes-no kind of question since the year 1900. Then it's going to look at changes in levels and kinds of religiosity since about the 1980s, which is the first time we've been able to get comparable survey data covering many countries and continuing over time. I'm going to talk about how religions become big economics and big politics. Then I'm going to sketch some of what we know about religious competition. And guess what? I'm an economist. There's going to be a demand side and a supply side, and I'm going to show how they link in the platform model. And then I'm going to talk at what I think are some of the most exciting and challenging and, frankly, sometimes difficult areas of study, which has to do with the relationship between religion and political power, how religions acquire and lose political power, and how they use and, importantly, abuse their power over their members. And then I'm going to try and be a bit more forward-looking and talk about implications for future research, implications for society, and summing up. Okay, so that's quite a big program. I'm going to go fast, and I will leave you to ask questions to the end, but you feel free to ask not only about things I have said, but about things I have not said. Okay, so let's start with changes in the shares of the world religions from 1900 to 2020. These are mainly based on census data. There's a fantastic project based at Boston University called the World Religion Database that has tried to bring all of these things together. And the first picture you get from this turns out to be entirely misleading. And in order to see why it's misleading, we need to look at the distribution of these changes across regions. So the first big picture, I want you to look at this figure, which gives you stacked from 1900 to 2020 shares in the world's population by essentially 9 different categories of religion. So there's agnostics, there's atheists, there's Buddhists, Chinese folk religionists, Christians, ethno-religionists, Hindus, Muslims, new religionists, and others. I didn't make these categories. This is the World Religion Database. Now, the take-home message from this is that, indeed, the share of Christians in the world population has declined. It was 34.5% in 1900. It's down to 32.2%. Okay, so on the face of it, it looks like Christianity is indeed on the retreat. And it's on the retreat in a pincer movement between who? Well, look, here are agnostics and atheists. There were none of them in 1900 and lots of them in 2020. And on the other side, there are Muslims, of whom there were, I can't quite read that, 13.4% and 24.2% in 2020. So the share's almost doubled. So the picture that I gave you early on appears to be completely and conclusively demonstrated by these shares in the world population. Now, first doubt is, hands up everybody in this audience who think there were no atheists in the world in the year 1900. Well, I'm not getting many hands up. So you obviously see the first problem is there were no atheists apparently in the world in 1900 because no survey ever thought to ask about them. Well, the first time they asked, there were not too many in 1950. But by 1970, there were nearly 20% of the world's population were classed as agnostics and atheists. And I think it's a fairly safe bet that that owed more to Stalin and Mao Zedong than it did to Voltaire. Okay? Now, by 2020, that share had fallen. There were barely, so this is 9.6%, there were actually not quite 12% of the world's population classified as agnostics and atheists. So the share had actually fallen since the high days of 1970 when agnostics and atheists were apparently very important. So that's the first thing. Now, let's look at the comparison between Christians and Muslims. And what I want to suggest to you is that this is a phenomenon known to statisticians as Simpson's paradox, which is where you have things that are going on in regions of the world which do not look the same when you aggregate it up because the populations of the regions of the world are changing at very different rates. And so the main reason why Christianity grew slowly over that period is that it was concentrated in areas of the world that were going to grow very slowly demographically. Here is a region of the world, namely Asia, which grew extremely fast from 1900 to 2020. And guess what? Christianity actually did very well there, but from an incredibly low base. 2.9% of the population of Asia were Christians in 1900. This had risen by nearly 3 times to 8% in 2020. So Christianity was powering ahead in Asia, but from an incredibly tiny base. Okay? And so very few of the world's babies, at least those in Asia, were going to be Christian anyway. All right? That's the main reason why Christianity grew very slowly over that period. Now, you can do an exercise, which I do in the book, which is to say, supposing that the only changes in the shares in the world were due to demography, and you projected forward from 1900 the shares of the different religious groups that you would expect to see in 2020, and then you compare it with what actually happened, what do you see? And here's the answer. You can project the shares that you expect to see in 2020. You take the actual shares, and how the actual shares compared to the projected shares are a measure of, in a sense, how dynamically those religious movements managed to compete in the intervening years. And this is what you see. Taking 1900 as a base year, you can do the same for later base years. The share of Christians in the population would have been expected to be 25.9%. Remember, this is starting from nearly 35%. So demographically, Christianity was competing with this enormous handicap because it was concentrated in areas of the world that were already starting to grow slowly. And compared to what you would have predicted from demography, the share of Christianity is 32.2%, nearly 7 percentage points of the world's population larger, okay? That's telling you that actually Christianity was competing incredibly dynamically in those regions of the world, but it was doing so against a very large demographic handicap, which, as we'll see later, we have no reason to see projected into the 21st century. Now, Islam similarly has grown very fast from 19.5% that you would have projected on demographics to 24.2%. But Islam also had a demographic advantage, but it's done extremely well even relative to the demographic advantage it had. Okay, so within religions there's also movement, and I'm going to skip over this quite fast, but basically what we're seeing is within the Christian denominations, we see a big move towards Pentecostal and charismatic churches away from traditional Protestant churches or other Christian movements, and certainly away from traditional religious denominations. Here in Kenya, for example, we see a huge increase in the share of Pentecostal churches, broadly classified, over a quarter century, from 22% of the Kenyan population to 50% of the Kenyan population, while the hold of traditional Christian denominations fell from nearly 3/4 to only just over 40%. Okay, so there are big changes within the denominations. So what's the story? Well, the story is absolutely not one of an ideological struggle between Christianity and Islam, with Islam winning. The reason Islam has expanded faster than Christianity is that it was concentrated in parts of the world that were destined to grow fast. It's instead a story about the corporatization and the branding of religion. And the places that have lost out are the places that have folk and ethnic religions which have been pushed to the margins. Now we're seeing movement within Christianity. As I say, Catholicism has declined, mainstream Protestantism has declined. But if we're trying to look ahead, we should not blindly project past demographic trends. We should look at the dynamism that each of these religious movements has within its regions of the world. Now, there are a lot of trends in the intensity of religiosity. This is the other big leg of the argument, so to speak, for the decline of religion. And it's very hard to get comparable data going back more than about 30 years. So we have to be extremely careful about what's happening, and I don't want to go to the stake for any of these numbers. But what I can tell you is the basic picture of religiosity as declining just doesn't hold up. So you can the way I'm going to give you the numbers here is I'm going to take the share of a country's population that says religion is either very or somewhat important in their lives. Now that proportion has declined in some countries in recent decades, in quite a few. In North America, absolutely. In Ireland, in Spain, in Chile, in Korea, and a number of other countries. But in quite a lot of countries, it's been low for as long as surveys have been done. So Japan, France, Germany, the UK. And it is not visibly declining further. Okay? This is about religiosity. This isn't about affiliation. Okay? In many former communist countries, it's increased. In Muslim countries, it remains extremely high, though it's clearly exaggerated in some of them. I discuss Iran a lot in the book, and there are good reasons for thinking the numbers there are not very reliable. But it's also very high and not declining in a whole range of countries in Latin America and Asia. So it's over 80% for Brazil, Colombia, Thailand, over 90% for Indonesia, Myanmar, the Philippines. You'll notice these are not just Islamic countries. They're in a big range of they're Buddhist, they're Muslim, they're Christian. And in Africa, the proportion saying religion is very important, is just very important. That's the top category, is over 90% in Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, and Zimbabwe. Okay, so what I've done here, and I think this is a figure that expresses the general point fairly clearly. I've drawn for every country a plot in which on the horizontal axis we have the level of that number, which is the proportion of the population saying religion is somewhat important or very important, in the earliest survey we have before the year 2000. And on the vertical axis, I've drawn it in the latest survey we have after the year 2000. And so if you take a 45-degree line, any country that lies below the 45-degree line is one where that number has declined. And any country above the 45-degree line is that one where that number has increased. Guess what? That is the 45-degree line, but it is not only statistically, but visually indistinguishable from the regression line. Okay? There is basically nothing happening at the aggregate level. There's lots happening at the level of particular countries, and somebody who wants to tell a story about religious decline can comfortably do that by focusing their attention on all of those countries under the 45-degree line, but there's lots of countries above the 45-degree line. And so at the world level, basically, there's no global trend. Now, then you can start to dig in and find patterns. There's a possibility that, in fact, if you look back at it, you'll see there's some sort of clumps. There's a bunch of countries up the top there. I can't even, sorry, I don't seem to have the pointer anymore, but it doesn't matter. You can see a bunch of countries up the top. You see some countries in the middle. You see a bunch of countries around 40%. And I talk a lot in the book about why that might be a stable state. And many of the countries don't see much movement. With the countries that are moving, you don't know whether they're moving in some sort of permanent way or whether they're just transitioning between different stable states in this distribution. It's a big statistical problem which we haven't even begun to analyze properly. Now we can then say, well, let's look at other dimensions of religiosity. Saying how important religion is to you is not the only thing that matters. So let's look at belief in God. Now belief in God they're way up to the right there. So many countries in which people say religion's not very important are still countries where they say they believe in God. And guess what? Here, the 45-degree line is also statistically and visually indistinguishable from the regression line. Now you get a little bit more going on, and this is where I was talking about mixing and matching. Here is where you get monthly attendance at religious services before and after 2000. And that actually is declining slightly. You do see more countries under the 45-degree line and fewer countries above it, but there's still a lot of countries above. Okay? So whatever story we want to tell about what's going on, it has to be a story that can explain both what is happening to the countries under the 45-degree line and what's happening to the countries above the 45-degree line. Okay, so let's take a step back. Historically, how have religions competed? Well, they've done so in three main ways. For the vast proportion of human history, they did so through war and conquest. Only in very much more recent times did they do so through two other mechanisms. One was through differential population growth, which you can think of as a form of demographic competition for resources. And the third mechanism is through persuasion, or as we economists would like to say, in the market. Now, it's the growth in the extent and sophistication of that third mechanism that my book wants to claim is the really outstanding and fascinating fact of the 21st century. So religion is really big business, and it's big politics. And here are just a few things to look at. This was a study done in 2013 of total charitable giving in the US, and what you'll see that from the 1970s to the 2010s, the take-home message from this is that charitable giving to education, foundations, health, the arts, the environment, and so on, which are all these little curves, was utterly dwarfed by charitable giving to religion. And we found similar things in particular countries we've looked at. Now, the other really interesting thing is it's very difficult to get data, but a careful study in 2016 estimated the revenues of faith-based organizations, as they call them, at nearly $400 billion. Now, is that a big number, a small number? How do you know? Well, think of it this way. It's bigger than the revenues of Apple and Microsoft in that year. It's more than 2% of total personal income in the US. It's equal to 60% of the revenues of the media and entertainment industries. That's everything. That's movies, that's video games, that's music, the lot. It's half the revenues of the US restaurant industry. And that is only the financial revenues. Okay? It doesn't include the everything that is given to those faith-based organizations in time, energy, and resources. And there are a lot of countries, I suggest Ghana is one of them, in which it's reasonable to think that about 1 adult in 5 is paying some tithes. It's probably 1 adult in 10 who's paying the full tithes, and another adult in 10 who's paying some proportion of their tithes. And that suggests that 2% of personal income probably characterizes quite a significant number of countries in the world. Now, big politics, I told you. So this is an evangelical prayer breakfast. This is a picture taken shortly before the invasion of Ukraine. This is a picture of Narendra Modi in India, worshipping at a Hindu shrine. This is, again, a fourth person whose personal religiosity would not have suspected from their early practices, supporting Buddhist temples. This is somebody else whose personal religiosity was not part of their brand, at least early in their career. And this is actually the exception. Erdogan was actually well known for being personally pious when he was mayor of Istanbul, but he also at that time was apparently committed to the secular vision of Turkish society, and he has since begun to use religion as part of his messaging. But so what the pictures show you is that the willingness to use religious messaging is not necessarily a reflection of the individual piety of the person concerned. And what do they get in return? Well, this is a very interesting video from a speech by one of the high-ranking monks in China's largest online Buddhist community, in which he says, now the range of China's rejuvenation is the globe. We have a good leader, President Xi. I feel really happy. He's the reincarnation of the Buddha, and he devotes to the country, the nation, and the lives around the world, regardless of himself. Now, you know, we all know President Xi is not subject to the same constraints of campaigning for re-election as perhaps some other people, but it can't be unpleasant to him that he has people saying he's the reincarnation of the Buddha. It probably makes his political life, as he would see it, a lot easier. So the question is, you know, why don't we see this everywhere? Why don't we see religious leaders and political leaders sort of permanently in some kind of coalition? And what a lot of the book is about how coalitions between religious and political leaders actually tend to come unstuck to the long-term cost of both the political leaders and the religious leaders. So, where have we got to so far? Well, the big story of religion in the 20th and 21st centuries is not this pincer movement that is destroying Christianity between militant Islam on the one hand and secular atheism on the other hand. It's this corporatization of religious life. And it's important to emphasize that I'm not telling a story about how, you know, the local and ethnic and folk religions are disappearing. They're not. They're moving to a new marginalized relationship with the big brands. So people typically in Africa, but in India and in Latin America and so on, will be, you know, worshipping and in going to festivals and traditions that owe very much to very traditional and folk religions part of the year, but they'll also be going to mosques or churches or temples that are part of much bigger religious movements. And so what the book is about is how religious organizations compete to meet those needs. Now, economists have forgotten that the pioneer of the analysis of the economics of religion was Adam Smith, who in Book 5 of The Wealth of Nations talked about how we should understand religious movements as competing for resources. And the theologians of the time were much exercised with why the dissenting movements were able apparently to fill their tents while the Church of England was unable to fill its churches. And there was a lot of discussion as to whether there were theological reasons for this. The dissenters, the Methodists, were accused of dumbing down and so on. It's just like you hear the description of the activities of certain kind of populist politicians. And Smith said, no, there's a much simpler reason. It's incentives. It's that if you're a Church of England parson, you basically have a guaranteed salary however many people you attract to your church. If you're a Methodist preacher and you can't attract people into your tent, you do not eat. And he said, that's all you need to know. I mean, he then said that's all you need to know at some length and very charming lengths, but that basically was the story. So the economics of religion has been part of the mainstream thinking of economists since Adam Smith, but it went underground for a long time, and it has come back. And in particular, Larry Iannacone pioneered the notion that religions could be thought of as clubs that provided exclusive services. And in lots of countries, this has been well documented. So Sriya has a fabulous book called The Economics of Religion in India, which is quite wrongly titled because it's the economics of religion everywhere, illustrated with respect to India. And I wish you'd sort of titled it in a way that reflected its ambitions. It's a fabulous book, and it's about the economics of religion, period. But it tells us in the process a lot about India, where many of these processes are happening too. And what we see is in many countries, religious movements are expanding the services they provide. So they provide a range of spiritual services, which I mentioned. There's ethical services, they provide ethical guidance, they provide ritual, they provide a story to people about why their lives are going the way they are, but then lots of secular things too. Health, finance, education, insurance, sport. And so what we do in the book, and I refer to a lot of research, some of this conducted by some of my co-authors and myself, is that we think of religious movements as offering bundles, but the bundles of services are tied together in important ways, that the value to you of going to your church for, say, health services or financial services is that it's not accidental, that your community, which also supplies your ritual and your moral narrative, is the one providing that. I'll give you some examples in a second. But what happens is that the members are not just the passive consumers of those services, they are active providers, and they are in many important senses the movement's own greatest assets. Some years ago, the entrepreneur Jerry Falwell produced a very telling analysis, very prescient analysis of what the evangelical churches are doing. He was saying business is usually on the cutting edge of innovation and change because of its quest for finances. Therefore, the church would be wise to look at business for a prediction of future innovation. The greatest innovation in the last 20 years is the development of the giant shopping centers. Here is the synergetic principle of placing at least 2 or more services at one location to attract the customers. A combination of services of 2 large customers with small supporting stores has been the secret of the success of shopping centers. So, I want to give you a little example, which is just illustrative. It's not the whole story, but it, I think, nicely illustrates the way in which these communities offer bundles of services. And they're not just accidentally bundled, they're intrinsically bundled. So when we were doing our work in Ghana, a number of people said to us, you think you should check out the possibility that many of these churches are places that people go to try and meet spouses. Okay? They want to meet future husbands and wives. So we said, okay, we'll try this out. And we, in the extensive debriefing that we did after the experiments, we gave people a list of reasons why they might go to their church. And there were about 25 of them. We said, tick all of the ones that are relevant. And they included, I go to find a husband, in the hope of finding a husband for myself or my children, depending on the age of the respondent. And basically almost nobody ticked it. It was about 5%. But then we thought, well, maybe maybe that's not the right way to answer the question. So we also separately in the questionnaire said to them, are you married? Yes, no. If you're married, where did you meet your spouse? If you're not married, where do you think you might meet your spouse? And then we asked the people who thought they might meet their spouse in church whether they had recently paid their tithes, and we compared it with the answers from the people who said they didn't think they would meet their spouse in church. And here are the results. So only 5% said that finding a partner is a main reason for attending church. But 28% of our married respondents said they found their spouse through church. Remember, these are the older part of the sample. Of the young people, 48% of our population is single, and 60% of those expect to meet their future spouse through church. And of the single males, it's interesting that the women weren't doing this, and those who study sort of the biology of gender might have an explanation for this. But of the single males who do expect to meet their spouse in church, 57 had paid their tithes that month, and only 26% of those who didn't expect to meet their spouse in church. Now, the important point, though, is, it seems to us pretty likely that at least the men who expect to meet a spouse in church are thinking that that's something worth investing in, okay? But it's also true that if I think back to this young woman, Grace, of course it would be one of the best things that could happen to her that if she could meet a husband in church rather than, I don't know, in a singles bar or on a dating website. I mean, Accra is a horrendously scary city. Of course church would be the best place, but she doesn't want to go to church to meet the kind of man who only goes to church to meet a wife, okay? So the test is really severe. The guy has to turn up at 9 a.m. on a Sunday morning, sober, in a clean suit, and sit through 3 hours of sermons. He has to attend the Sunday school with her. He has to talk to the pastor convincingly about the importance of moral guidance in his future life and his future family life. This is a lot of very helpful screening that the church is able to do on Grace's behalf. Okay, so it turns out that when you ask them, the people say, undoubtedly, sincerely, that they want counseling for family issues, okay? They also admit to asking pastors for financial help, but those who say they would ask for financial help are dwarfed by those who say they have received financial help. So that matters, but the whole point of the example is that it's a package, okay? We don't want to say they're just going to church for this or they're just going to church for that. They're going to church to join a community that gives them all of that together. Okay, so finally we did ask people how would they prefer to choose their friends, their co-workers and their business partners, and would they want to interact only with church members or preferably with church members, or would it not matter? And the take-home message from this, it's about half of them say only or preferably church members. So again, it's not for everybody. People are mixing and matching. Some people are quite happy to go to church because it's a way to keep the kids occupied on Sunday, and they probably don't think very much about it from one Sunday to the next. Other people are going because it's really an important part of building their community. So the book talks a lot about that. Now, when the book then takes off into territory that's a bit less familiar to economists, it asks questions about how religious movements acquire and lose political power. And the basic story, which goes back to Adam Smith, is that when these platform movements are successful, it creates a great deal of envy among politicians who want to instrumentalize the legitimacy that those platforms have required. And some of those pictures should make it clear why they do that. Now, it's particularly strong in authoritarian political movements, or where religious movements have benefited from the collapse of previous anti-religious regimes, as we see in the end of communism in Europe and in East Asia. So the story you would have to tell in Poland, for example, is that religiosity soared after the collapse of the communist regime, partly because the church had done very honorable work standing up for oppressed people under the previous regime, regardless of their degree of religiosity. The great thing about Poland in the 1970s and the 1980s was you didn't have to be a stalwart of the Catholic Church for the church to stand up to you. It did not discriminate between the highly religious and the somewhat religious. It was just bravely in support of all of the population who were being oppressed by the regime. And so, as you can imagine, after the fall of communism, the popularity of the Catholic Church absolutely soared. And that's when the leaders of the church made their big mistake. They realized, I mean, it was heady, they were deferred to by the entire population, and they basically blew it. They decided that they were going to use alliances with parties that represented a small part of the political spectrum to try and get their own policies passed. And I don't want to spend more, I discuss Poland a lot in that case. But so we see an example of what Adam Smith thought of as a kind of life cycle of religious movements, where when they start, they acquire legitimacy on their own right. Then they become irresistibly tempting to political leaders who offer them a deal, and that is irresistibly tempting to at least some of the religious leaders, and then the deal comes unstuck because it basically undermines the legitimacy of both the religious leaders and the political leaders. And the actual decline can be triggered by lots of things. It can be triggered by political crises, like the end of dictatorship in Spain and in Chile. It can be triggered by corruption, as in South Korea. It can be triggered by partisan instrumentalization, as we see in Iran, and possibly as we see in the United States at the moment. And it can be triggered by internal crises such as sexual abuse, which we are seeing everywhere, and I'm going to return to in a moment. So how do those movements use and then abuse their power? Well, what determines the exercise of power by religious leaders is basically the constraints they face. And that is a central message of the book. There's nothing special about religious power. Basically, as I say, they're no different from political leaders who gain power by more conventional means. If they have gained power, they will use it and abuse it according to the constraints that they face on doing that. And that's not quite everything you need to know, but that is most of what you need to know to understand why religious power has been abused. Now, these constraints create very different incentives for those movements in the exercise of coercion against different groups of victims. So when movements use coercion against their own members, they're doing something very different from when they exercise coercion against members of close rival movements and against members of more distant rival movements. And so there has now become some very interesting recent work. So Sasha Becker and Luigi Pascali, for example, have done a fantastic job analyzing the determinants of anti-Jewish pogroms in Europe after the Reformation, in which he shows that the movement of Protestants into the financial sector from where they had previously been barred because of the Catholic Church's ban on lending for interest, then created a degree of rivalry which was stronger in areas in which Jews had taken a large part in the financial sector. And so he shows that the pattern of anti-Jewish programs was very strongly correlated with areas in which the Jews had previously had high representation in the financial sector and where they were now being faced by competition from Protestants. So I talk a lot in the book about those kinds of things, the different incentives that religious movements have for abusing power against different kinds of groups. Now, I said I wanted to talk about implications for future research, and there's potentially a huge amount of it. First of all is the microeconomics of religious choice. I'm not going to say much more about it, except that there's lots in the book, and I really do want to emphasize that people are making their religious choices not as they're choosing their washing machines or their stereo players. There's a whole implication of their personal identity in this, and I discuss in the book some of what we're learning about that. I think it's a very rich field, but in some sense we already know that. Then I think the links between religion and politics are wide open for studying using comparative cross-country data over a period of time. So, for example, with my former PhD student, Julia Hofer, we're looking at the impact of political sponsorship on religiosity, and we're finding that over the period of the World Values Survey, which is about 40 years, we're seeing that in areas where political sponsorship of religion is high, we have basically quite high public religiosity, that's to say attendance at services, but very rapidly declining private religiosity and also belief in the, let's say, confidence in the trustworthiness of the religious institutions. There's a problem there because the extent of political sponsorship of religion may be, as economists would say, endogenous. It may be determined by other things, and so we're trying to look at what happens when political power changes hands because of elections that are closely contested, to use that as a kind of experimental test of when the extent of political sponsorship of religion changes. Then there's religion and violence. I've already talked about that. I think this is a wide open field. It's very clear that religious movements are sometimes very active in seeking for peace, and I know that TRT is sponsoring a whole program on religion and peacemaking, but it's also true historically that they have used violence, and I think the data are starting to show us something systematic about the circumstances in which they have used violence and when they have not, and against whom they use it. Now, we also need a more rigorous approach to this debate on secularization, and I think up to now there's been a large literature in sociology in which sort of people have just said, these are what the latest rounds of data are showing, they're going up here, they're going down here, allowing the proponents of different views to cherry pick their preferred examples. I don't want to name too many names, but there is a large literature, for example, on religion and fertility, with many of the proponents of the traditional views of secularization saying that fertility is declining in the world and we know that religiosity will follow it. But basically, what you will find is that fertility is declining absolutely everywhere in the world, but it's doing so at different speeds. Even in sub-Saharan Africa, it's declining very fast. Now, it's still high, so there are many countries in sub-Saharan Africa where it's still about 4 or even higher. But to fall to 4 from 6.5 or 7 is already a spectacular fall. And many of those countries are ones where religiosity is high and shows no sign of declining. So if you believe that where religiosity falls, where fertility falls, religiosity falls immediately, the data to the very least are posing a challenge for that. I think we need to understand how religions compete when they face secular rivals. So I mentioned the fact that in areas of ritual and narrative, many religious movements don't face serious competition from secular providers, but they do face serious competition from secular providers of health services and many financial services and so forth. And I think there's a lot of scope for trying to understand exactly where the religious movements find their comparative advantage, where they find their niche. And in particular, I think mixing and matching over the religious life cycle. So one of the things that proponents of the traditional secularization view point to is they say, well, look at the young people, all of the new young generation. These are all social media users. They go to the cities, they're on dating websites. They're not interested in traditional religion. Just wait till they turn into their early 30s and they have kids, and they're starting to worry about how they're going to bring up their kids in scary cities where gangs recruit them at young ages to sell drugs. Then you suddenly find a lot of these same people who were mixing and matching very freely start to think that actually it's probably quite a good idea to take their kids to church on Sunday. And interestingly, and this is one of the paradoxes, that many people say, we don't understand why so many women support the evangelical and Pentecostal movements when they preach such a patriarchal view of the place of women. And what I think that observation misses is that the view of family life that Pentecostal and evangelical churches propose is not just one in which women are subordinate to men. It's one in which men have duties. And men as heads of the household are expected to show up and support their wives and their children and earn enough money and be sober and not beat them and this kind of thing. And in many cities in the world, there's really nobody else able to enforce that kind of arrangement between women and men and their families that the church and temple and mosque communities have a reasonable chance of being able to do. Then I think there's a whole set of areas on religion and psychology. One of the things that I became convinced of in doing the book was, I started out trying to think, what is this thing called religiosity? How does it work in the brain, in the psyche, and so on? And I'm now convinced there is no such thing, by which I don't mean that people aren't religious. What I mean is, and it's an insight that goes well back to William James in the Varieties of Religious Experience, when he said, there is no such thing as religious awe. There is just awe which is directed to a religious object. There is no such thing as religious anger, there is anger that is directed to religious object. There is no such thing as religious love. There is love that is directed to religious object. And I think that if you look at the activities of these platforms, historically they've included everything from private prayer, meditation, crusades. You know, you can be religiously violent. If the platform offers you a combination of activities that appeal to those kinds of emotions, you'll be a very different kind of person from someone whose principal aim and whose principal response to what the platform offers to you is something of private prayer and reflection. So I think we should be able to look at that more. And I was going to close on the implications of future research by looking at AI, and I can't, so I have some pictures, but I'll tell you what's in the pictures since I can't seem to get to them. So very soon after the book came out, I followed a debate on an Indian forum about whether AI was going to make it difficult to interpret messages from the god Krishna. And what a number of people were seriously worried about, they said, we now know that, I mean, there's a thing called Gita GPT that generates messages from Krishna, which I was going to show you a picture of. And they were going to say, you know, how do we know which are the true messages from Krishna and which are the false messages from Krishna? Now, whatever you think of that question, whatever you think of the answer, I can tell you with confidence one thing, which is that is not the first time in history that that question has been asked. And indeed, members of religious movements have been asking questions about the authenticity of the messages they receive for hundreds and thousands of years. The invention of printing in the 15th century directly provoked the Reformation in the 16th century, and the turbulence that followed was entirely the result of people having access to new ways of generating messages in a different language from what was possible before, which led to a tremendous bubbling up of religious movements. And we are seeing essentially a new Reformation today, prompted by new technologies of digital communication, of artificial intelligence, and so on. Now, many people thought that printing would destroy religion. It didn't. It upset religion, but ultimately reinvigorated it. And I think we can confidently say that digital technology and artificial intelligence will do the same today. So, if am I allowed to wind up with, implications for society. How long have I got? How many minutes? Okay. So, I promised you implications for society. Now, the book essentially puts forward a view that religious movements are businesses. And that's essentially has two faces to it. One is that they're legitimate businesses. And people who think there's something illegitimate about selling religious services in the marketplace should think again. They are utterly legitimate as much as anything else is. But if you take that seriously, then they have obligations of accountability as other businesses do. So they should publish accounts. In many countries, they don't have to. In the United States, I could set up the Seabright Salvation Ministry. I could just open a street front address. I could take money from the general public, and unless somebody denounces me to the IRS, and unless the IRS decides it's going to take the political risk of investigating me, I will never have to pay any tax on a single cent of that income. Now, that doesn't seem right, and it also doesn't seem a good foundation for a healthy relationship between religion and society in the 21st century. So they should publish accounts. Their tax status should be aligned with comparable secular organizations. I don't take a view as to whether they should be tax exempt or not, but there should be reasons why their tax status should be what it is, which are not just that they're religious organizations. And importantly, they should be subject to common legal oversight of the treatment of members and other stakeholders. So many of you will have been aware that the Church of England is looking, as The Guardian put it, for a new CEO. As it happens, the case which caused the resignation of Justin Welby is discussed extensively in chapter 12 of my book, where I say that at the time of writing, Justin Welby had faced no adverse consequences for his failure to act decisively on what he at that time knew. I didn't expect that the book would go out of date so quickly in that dimension, and I can't say I'm sorry. But what's important is not who's to blame. In some sense, he was unfortunate to find himself exposed for doing what pretty well every other leader of every other major religious organization has always done. But what's clear is that the CEO that the Church of England needs is being chosen in an attempt to reinvent the wheel without thinking about how corporate governance works in any of the areas of business outside religious movements. And I think those who study corporate governance, those who study the economics of organizations, those who study the way in which abuse can happen in organizations when vulnerable people are placed next to people in power, those kinds of lessons can be passed from the study of secular organizations with great benefit, I think, to the study of religious organizations. And overall, the book calls for an arm's length relationship between religion and politics as being in the interests of both religious and political movements. I think I should probably stop there. There is a bit more to go, but I will stop. So thank you very much.